It begins with silence, the kind that fills a room when a ghost passes through. A single photograph of Charles Lucky Luciano stares back from history. Slick hair, half a smile, and eyes that seem to know something the rest of the world doesn't. He's been called many things: the architect of modern organized crime, the devil in a tailored suit, the man who killed honor. But before the myths and the headlines, before the betrayals and the blood, there was just a young immigrant chasing a dream in a city built on broken promises. The story of Lucky Luciano isn't just the story of a gangster. It's the story of America in its most ruthless form, a place where ambition and morality constantly collide. It's about how one man turned chaos into order, loyalty into leverage, and crime into capitalism. It's about the moment when honor stopped being sacred and became negotiable. To understand Luciano is to understand the transformation of the Mafia from an old-world brotherhood into a modern corporation of crime. The Sicilian Mafia that crossed the Atlantic carried with it centuries of silence, of codes, of family loyalty that could not be broken even by death. But in America, where money was the new god, those ancient codes began to crack. Luciano saw the future in those fractures. To him, tradition was a cage. He believed the underworld could evolve, that business could replace blood, and that rules could be rewritten by those bold enough to challenge them. He was right, and that's what made him dangerous. The 1920s were roaring. Jazz spilled from the clubs of Harlem, speakeasies hummed with forbidden laughter, and money, dirty or clean, flowed through every alleyway of New York City. Prohibition turned petty crooks into millionaires overnight. Behind the glittering skyline, a different empire was rising, one built on smuggling, gambling, prostitution, and power. It was an empire without a king, and Luciano wanted the throne. But there's a darker irony at play. For every code he broke, for every betrayal he justified, Luciano told himself it was progress. He wasn't destroying the Mafia, he was saving it. That's the psychological hook of his story, a man who believed that corruption could be civilized. His vision was cold, logical, and revolutionary. If crime was inevitable, then it should be organized, efficient, and profitable. The underworld, he believed, deserved a corporate structure, and he was the man to build it. Yet, in building it, he also destroyed something ancient, something human. The very idea of honor among thieves dissolved under his rule. Loyalty was no longer a sacred bond, it was a business arrangement. The same system that made him powerful would later consume him, piece by piece, as betrayal became the new currency of survival. To tell Luciano's story is to explore the anatomy of power, how it seduces, corrupts, and isolates. It's about the line between strategy and sin, between order and tyranny. Luciano's genius wasn't in pulling triggers or running rackets. It was in understanding people, what they feared, what they wanted, what they'd trade for a sense of belonging. He turned fear into structure and loyalty into law. But when the dust settled, the law he created had no soul. As this documentary unfolds, we'll travel through the smoky backrooms of Manhattan speakeasies, across the blood-soaked streets of gangland wars, and into the cold corridors of power where politicians, cops, and mobsters shook hands behind closed doors. We'll see the faces of the men who followed him, and the ones who betrayed him. We'll explore how his empire rose and how it fell. But most of all, we'll look at the moral cost of his revolution. Because Lucky Luciano's life isn't just about organized crime. It's about the American dream stripped of its illusions. It's about what happens when success becomes more important than integrity, when loyalty is just another tool of manipulation. The story begins not with a gunshot but with a question. What happens to honor when it meets ambition? And in the end, perhaps the more haunting question is this: did Lucky Luciano destroy honor, or did he simply expose that it never really existed at all? Before Luciano, the American underworld was a battlefield without order. The criminal landscape of early 20th century New York was a patchwork of ethnic gangs, Italian, Irish, Jewish, each controlling scraps of territory and fighting endless, bloody wars for dominance. The Mafia that Luciano would one day mold into a corporation was then a collection of feuding clans, bound by old-world codes but torn apart by new-world greed. On the surface, America was roaring with industry and optimism. Immigrants poured into Ellis Island by the millions, chasing dreams of freedom and prosperity. But for many, the streets of New York offered only exploitation and poverty. Tenements overflowed with families struggling to survive, and for some, crime wasn't a choice, it was the only way out. In neighborhoods like the Lower East Side and Little Italy, kids learned early that respect came not from school or church, but from the gang that ruled the block. The Sicilian immigrants brought with them a shadow, the Mafia traditions of their homeland. Back in Sicily, the Mafia had been born as a kind of vigilante system, protecting locals from corrupt governments and foreign rulers. Its guiding principles were simple: honor, silence, and loyalty. But when those values crossed the Atlantic, they collided with America's feverish capitalism. The result was something unstable, combustible, a new breed of criminal who worshipped profit more than pride. By the 1910s, New York's Italian gangs were at war not just with rival ethnic groups but with each other. The Morello family controlled Harlem and parts of the Bronx, enforcing their will through intimidation and bloodshed. Across the river, the Camorra, a Neapolitan faction, carved out their own turf in Brooklyn. Both claimed to represent the old ways, but in truth, they were no more than ambitious street bosses fighting over bootlegging routes, gambling dens, and protection rackets. The streets ran red, and the press gave it a name: the Black Hand. Newspapers sensationalized the violence: kidnappings, extortion, assassinations, feeding the public's fear of the Italian menace. Behind the hysteria, however, the truth was simpler. There was no unified mafia. There were only fragments, hungry men with knives and guns, chasing power in a world with no rules. Prohibition would change everything. When the Volstead Act went into effect in 1920, banning the sale of alcohol, America's moral crusade accidentally opened the largest criminal opportunity in modern history. Bootlegging became the gold rush of the underworld. Suddenly, anyone with guts, connections, and the willingness to kill could become a millionaire. But that kind of money magnified chaos. Street gangs grew into syndicates, alliances formed and crumbled overnight, and loyalty became a weapon. The Irish gangs, led by figures like Owney Madden and Big Bill Dwyer, dominated the beer trade. Jewish mobsters like Arnold Rothstein financed the operations, turning illegal liquor into a corporate business. And the Italians, split by family feuds and old grudges, lagged behind, too trapped in their codes of honor, to see that the game had changed. It was a time when respect meant nothing without power, and power could be bought. The old Sicilian bosses ruled by fear and superstition, whispering about omerta, the vow of silence, as if it were holy scripture. But in the roaring streets of New York, omerta was already breaking. Younger gangsters saw that survival depended not on tradition, but on adaptation. In smoky backrooms and dimly lit taverns, a new generation of criminals began to talk, quietly, carefully, about cooperation. They looked around and saw opportunity wasted by the arrogance of the old men. Among them were names that would soon change history: Meyer Lansky, a sharp-minded Jewish kid from Minsk; Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a violent dreamer with charm; and a young Italian named Charles Luciano, who was already learning how to play both sides of the street. But before Luciano could rise, the world had to fall apart. The Mafia's first great civil war, the Castellamarese War, was brewing beneath the surface. Two titans, Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, would soon fight for absolute control of New York's Italian underworld. Their soldiers would kill, betray, and die in the name of bosses who claimed to fight for honor. In reality, it was business, brutal, bloody business. The immigrant dream that had once promised hope now birthed an empire of violence. The streets of Mulberry, Bowery, and Coney Island became arenas where loyalty was tested with bullets. The police were overwhelmed, politicians were bought, and the line between law and crime began to blur. America, for all its ideals, had created the perfect breeding ground for men like Luciano. Men who understood that order could be built even from chaos, as long as one had the will to do what others wouldn't. Luciano watched and learned. He saw the old bosses cling to their Sicilian hierarchies, refusing to deal with Jews or Irishmen. He saw them kill over insults instead of profits. And he understood even then that if the underworld was ever to survive, it needed to evolve. The future would belong not to the loyal but to the clever, to those who could see crime not as passion but as enterprise. In that fractured world of greed and blood, the seeds of revolution were planted. The gangs of New York were tearing each other apart, unaware that one young gangster was watching from the shadows, quietly taking notes. Soon he would reshape everything they stood for, and in doing so he would write the first modern chapter of organized crime. The world before Luciano was chaos, wild, ungoverned, and hungry. But from that chaos, a vision was forming. A vision of power that would outlive every boss, every code, every illusion of honor. The stage was set, the players already moving. All it needed now was someone bold enough to rewrite the rules. And that someone was Lucky Luciano. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in the sun-baked town of Lercora, Sicily, a place defined by poverty, superstition, and silence. The Sicilian hills were beautiful but unforgiving, and the only rule that mattered was survival. His father, Antonio, was a humble sulfur miner who dreamed of something better for his family. So, when Salvatore was 9, the Lucanias boarded a crowded ship bound for America. Like millions of immigrants before them, they believed New York City was the land of opportunity. But for the Lucanias, the American dream began in the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side, a world of cramped rooms, factory smoke, and street gangs. It was a place where the sound of church bells mixed with police sirens, where every corner was ruled by kids with quick fists and quicker knives. English was a language of power they didn't yet speak, and respect was earned not with good manners but with fear. Salvatore, small and sharp-eyed, learned that lesson early. School offered no salvation. Teachers mocked his accent, kids bullied him for his ragged clothes. So he turned to the only place that offered protection, the streets. By the time he was 10, he had joined a neighborhood gang. By 14, he was running errands for pimps and gamblers. By 17, he'd already been arrested for possession, assault, and petty theft. But even in those rough beginnings, there was something different about him. The other kids fought for pride. Salvatore fought for position. He was calculating, always watching, always learning. He understood that fear was useful, but respect, genuine respect, was more powerful. He never acted out of rage. Every move he made was measured, every relationship transactional. He was poor, but he thought like a businessman. The streets became his education, and the Lower East Side his classroom. He studied men like Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish gambler who fixed the 1919 World Series, from afar, fascinated by how power could be quiet, organized, and clean. He also met other young hustlers who shared his ambition, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. It was an unlikely trio, an Italian Catholic, a Jewish intellectual, and a Jewish brawler, but together they would rewrite the rules of organized crime. In an era when ethnic loyalty defined survival, their friendship was revolutionary. The old world bosses despised the idea of mixing with outsiders, but Luciano didn't see outsiders, he saw opportunity. Lansky had brains and discipline. Siegel had violence and charisma. Luciano had vision. Together they began experimenting with small-scale rackets, protection, gambling, and bootlegging, learning the value of trust that wasn't bound by blood, but by profit. Luciano's nickname, Lucky, came after a near-death encounter that would shape his myth forever. In 1929 he was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on Staten Island. Some say by rivals, others say as punishment for refusing to pay tribute to a powerful boss. Miraculously he survived, scarred but alive. From that day on he embraced the nickname Lucky, not just as a badge of survival but as a symbol of destiny. The attack left one of his eyes slightly drooping, giving him that cold, half-lidded stare that would later become his trademark. It was more than a wound, it was a transformation. He came back harder, sharper, and more determined. If death couldn't stop him, nothing would. By the early 1920s, Luciano was working under Joe, the boss Masuria, the most powerful Italian mobster in New York. Masuria represented everything old world, suspicious, brutal, and obsessed with control. He demanded loyalty, but he offered no vision. Luciano quickly saw that under bosses like Masuria, the Mafia would eat itself alive. The Sicilians were too rigid, too emotional. They killed for pride, not profit. To Luciano that was bad business. Meanwhile, America was changing. Prohibition had turned gangsters into entrepreneurs. Booze was illegal, but demand was insatiable. The underworld exploded with wealth and chaos. Luciano and his partners, Lansky, Siegel, and Frank Costello, built their fortune moving liquor across state lines, partnering with anyone who could guarantee supply and safety. They worked with Irish gangs, Jewish financiers, and even corrupt police officers. Luciano didn't care where the money came from, only that it flowed. That pragmatism set him apart. He wasn't a saint, but he wasn't impulsive either. He didn't crave violence for its own sake. He used it as a tool, always calculated, always strategic. When rivals disrespected him, he didn't rush to retaliate. He waited until the outcome benefited him. This made him dangerous in ways most gangsters couldn't comprehend. But Luciano wasn't just changing the criminal world, he was changing himself. He began to dress like a Wall Street executive, wearing silk suits and speaking English with confidence. He dined at the Waldorf, moved among businessmen, and learned how politics could protect crime. He paid cops, judges, and city officials not just for protection but for access. He was building something larger than a gang, he was building a system. Yet, beneath the ambition, there was always the echo of the streets, that Lower East Side hunger that never left him. He had escaped poverty, but he carried its lessons like scars. Trust no one completely. Always control the deal. Always be ready to walk away. By his late 20s, Luciano had everything a street kid could dream of: money, influence, and power. But he wanted more, not just control over his own life but over the entire underworld. He saw that chaos still ruled the streets. The Italian gangs were splintered, the old bosses were stubborn, and war was coming. Luciano believed he was the only one capable of ending it, by force if necessary. He wasn't wrong. The kid from Naples who once dodged beatings in the alleys of the Lower East Side was now poised to take on the Mafia itself. He would do what no one before him dared to do: challenge the traditions of his own people, betray his own bosses, and rebuild organized crime in his image. And in doing so he would prove that the American dream, even in its darkest form, belonged not to the righteous but to the ruthless. Because in Luciano's world, survival wasn't luck. It was strategy. By the time the dust of the 1920s began to settle, New York's underworld was at a breaking point. Every street corner had a king, every racket a boss, and every boss believed himself untouchable. The Italian Mafia was tearing itself apart, trapped in endless feuds between the old mustache Petes, the Sicilian traditionalists, and the ambitious young Americans who saw crime as a business, not a blood oath. At the center of this storm stood Lucky Luciano, a man with the mind of a strategist and the patience of a predator. Luciano's years under Joe, the boss Mafia, had taught him everything he needed to know about power, and about its limits. Mafia demanded absolute loyalty but gave little in return. He was a relic of another age, obsessed with old customs and blind to opportunity. To Mafia, being a boss meant being feared. To Luciano, it meant being indispensable. Luciano saw that Mafia's rule was unsustainable. The underworld was too fractured, too violent. There had to be a better way. While Mafia relied on his Sicilian enforcers, Luciano quietly built alliances beyond his own ethnicity. He met with Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Irish bootleggers like Auntie Madden, and Italian Americans who, like him, had no interest in being slaves to the old ways. Together, they envisioned something revolutionary: a unified underworld that operated like a corporation, where business came before blood and profit before pride. The turning point came during the bloody Castellamarese War, a brutal power struggle between Joe Mafia and Salvatore Maranzano, two titans of the old world fighting to be crowned boss of bosses. For nearly 2 years, from 1930 to 1931, New York streets became killing fields. Hitmen stalked the alleys of Brooklyn and Manhattan. Dozens were gunned down in restaurants, stairwells, and barber chairs. It wasn't war, it was suicide. Luciano, caught in the middle, pretended to serve Mafia but quietly communicated with Maranzano. He understood that neither man could lead the Mafia into the future. Both were prisoners of the Sicilian mindset, obsessed with hierarchy, honor, and revenge. Luciano wanted something else: structure, efficiency, and stability. And so, he made a decision that would change the course of organized crime forever. In April 1931, Luciano invited Mafia to lunch at a small restaurant in Coney Island. They played cards, shared a meal, and when Luciano excused himself to use the restroom, the doors opened for betrayal. 4 gunmen, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel, stormed in and executed Mafia in cold blood. The old boss was dead, his empire dismantled with one sound of gunfire. But the victory was only temporary. Maranzano, seeing his rival gone, immediately crowned himself Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of bosses. Luciano realized with cold clarity that the cycle of tyranny hadn't ended. It had simply changed hands. Maranzano began reorganizing the Mafia along Roman military lines, demanding tribute, obedience, and blood loyalty. To Luciano it was a farce. Maranzano wanted to be Caesar. Luciano wanted to build an empire that didn't need one. 5 months later he struck again. In September 1931, Luciano set up a meeting with Maranzano at his office on Park Avenue. But instead of showing up himself, he sent a team of assassins disguised as tax agents. They entered the office, pulled their weapons, and ended Maranzano's reign in less than a minute. The Roman Empire of crime fell before it began. That day marked the birth of the modern American Mafia. Luciano abolished the title of boss of bosses, declaring that no single man should ever hold absolute power again. Instead, he created a new system, a democratic body known as the Commission. It would consist of the heads of the most powerful crime families, each with equal say in matters of business and territory. It was part parliament, part boardroom, and part battlefield negotiation table. Luciano divided New York's underworld into 5 major families: his own, led by him, the Genovese family, later named in his honor, the Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Prophesai families. Each controlled its own territory but answered to the Commission for National-Level Disputes. This was Luciano's greatest innovation. He turned chaos into structure, transforming what had been a criminal free-for-all into an organized network that resembled a corporate hierarchy. For the first time, peace seemed possible. The Commission met regularly, not in smoky backrooms but in elegant hotels and restaurants, where they discussed profits, distribution, and logistics as calmly as businessmen discussing stock portfolios. Bootlegging, narcotics, gambling, and labor racketeering were all carefully divided to avoid bloodshed. Luciano's goal wasn't moral, it was pragmatic. "You can't make money when you're dead," he told his associates. Violence was bad for business and business was everything. Under Luciano's leadership, alliances extended far beyond the Italian Mafia. Jewish gangsters like Lansky and Siegel became full partners, providing capital, intelligence, and connections. They controlled the financial side of operations while the Italians handled protection and enforcement. It was a perfect, if uneasy, marriage, a merging of brains and muscle. This coalition became known informally as the National Crime Syndicate, a loose but powerful network of criminal organizations across the United States. From New York to Chicago, Atlantic City to Los Angeles, Luciano's model spread like wildfire. He wasn't just a boss anymore, he was a CEO of organized crime. But for all its brilliance, the system had a price. To build peace, Luciano had to betray. To create order, he had to destroy. His assassinations of Masuria and Maranzano were seen as acts of treachery by the old guard, but to Luciano they were necessary sacrifices, the cost of progress. He justified it the way any empire builder would, by convincing himself it was for the greater good. Still, the blood of those choices would never fully wash away. Behind every treaty he brokered and every handshake he offered was the echo of gunfire. Even as he built an empire of cooperation, he had planted the seeds of distrust that would one day destroy it. By 1932, Luciano had achieved what no one before him could. He had turned gangsters into businessmen, rivals into shareholders, and chaos into structure. The five families were born, not as a symbol of unity, but as an organized system of calculated control. And for a time it worked. The streets grew quieter, profits soared, and Lucky Luciano reigned not from a throne, but from a conference table. Yet, beneath the calm, something darker stirred, because when you strip crime of honor, all that remains is ambition. And ambition, no matter how organized, always finds a way to turn brotherhood into betrayal. When Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano were dead, it wasn't just the end of two men, it was the death of an era. The blood that soaked the floors of Coney Island and Park Avenue didn't merely eliminate rivals. It washed away centuries of Sicilian hierarchy. For the first time, power in the underworld didn't come from birthright or bloodline. It came from strategy, from vision, from Lucky Luciano. But even as the streets quieted and the five families took shape, a deeper transformation was underway, one not written in ink or signed with a handshake, but sealed in silence and blood. Luciano had replaced tradition with structure, but to maintain control, he still needed one thing the old Mafia understood better than anyone: fear disguised as loyalty. In the early 1930s, Luciano gathered his lieutenants and explained his new philosophy: crime as an institution, loyalty as currency. The men who had followed him through years of war listened in awe. For them he was more than a leader, he was a prophet. Gone were the days of kneeling before bosses of bosses. The Mafia, Luciano declared, would no longer bow to one man, but every man would still bow to the system. That system was built on two pillars: profit and silence. Every member of a crime family had an obligation, not to a person but to the organization itself. Breaking that loyalty, speaking to law enforcement, betraying a deal, these were not sins, they were death sentences. Omerta, the code of silence, remained sacred, but its meaning changed. Under the old Sicilian bosses, Omerta was about honor. Under Luciano it was about control. He understood something few gangsters did: loyalty is not born, it's engineered. And he engineered it perfectly. The induction ceremony, the making of a made man, was his masterpiece of psychological manipulation. A man's hand would be pricked, his blood dripping onto a holy card, which was then set aflame in his palm as he swore eternal allegiance to his family. May my soul burn like this saint if I betray the organization. It was theater, yes, but powerful theater. Luciano kept the ritual not because he believed in its mysticism, but because he knew men needed myths to obey. Underneath the ritual, however, everything had changed. The Mafia's family, was no longer a bond of kinship or homeland. It was a business network, a corporation of criminals held together by fear, greed, and mutual benefit. Loyalty became transactional. Betrayal inevitable. And yet, for a time it worked beautifully. Each of the 5 families operated like a department in a multinational company. There were supply chains, profit margins, accountants, and enforcers. The commission acted as a board of directors, resolving disputes and maintaining balance. Luciano's word carried weight not because of superstition, but because of success. Under his guidance, the Mafia grew richer, smarter, and more disciplined than ever before. He wasn't running a gang anymore, he was running a government. In this new order, violence became strategic, not emotional. Murders weren't acts of passion. They were calculated removals, sanctioned only when necessary. Luciano and his peers even created the most infamous enforcement arm in Mafia history, Murder Incorporated, led by Jewish gangsters like Louis Lepka Buckelter and Abe Kid Twist Relis. It was a corporate death squad, responsible for hundreds of executions nationwide. Every hit was a message, every message a reminder. Disobedience had no survivors. But beneath the surface of order was a moral void. Luciano's revolution had created efficiency at the cost of humanity. The old code of honorata societa, the honored society, was gone. In its place stood a machine, cold and unfeeling, where loyalty was bought and sold like any other commodity. Even within the commission, trust was conditional. A smile could hide betrayal. A handshake could be a death warrant. Luciano justified it all with one belief: progress demanded sacrifice. He saw himself as a modernizer, a man cleansing the Mafia of its sentimental weaknesses. Business is business, he liked to say. To him, betrayal wasn't immoral, it was necessary if it kept the organization alive. And in many ways it did. The Mafia's reach expanded beyond the shadows. It infiltrated labor unions, nightclubs, movie studios, and construction companies. Politicians were bought, judges compromised, police captains paid to look the other way. The line between crime and respectability blurred until they became indistinguishable. Luciano had created not just a criminal empire, but an ecosystem, one that fed off the greed of an entire nation. Still, there was an irony that even Luciano couldn't see. By killing the old system of loyalty, he ensured that no one, not even him, would ever be safe again. The world he built depended on compliance, not conviction. Men followed him because it was profitable, not because they believed in him. And when profits faltered or fear shifted, that same loyalty could vanish in an instant. This was the paradox of Luciano's empire. To make it stable, he had to make it soulless. In private moments, those close to him noticed a certain detachment in his demeanor. He rarely laughed without calculation, rarely trusted without reason. He was surrounded by friends, yet perpetually alone, the architect of a world where trust was an illusion. Even his allies, Lansky and Costello, admired him but never forgot what he was capable of. They'd seen what happened to men who mistook partnership for friendship. Luciano once said, "There's no such thing as good or bad business, only smart or stupid business." That was his creed, and it guided every decision he made. But in chasing the perfect criminal system, he had built something even darker, a mirror of the American dream itself. A system where success justified everything. By the mid-1930s, the Mafia was more organized than the police, richer than legitimate companies, and more disciplined than any government. The honor of old Sicily was dead, replaced by efficiency, fear, and silent obedience. And though the streets were calm, the cost was heavy, because when loyalty becomes a lie, peace is only temporary. The world had entered the Luciano era, a world without kings, without honor, without mercy. A world where murder was business, and business was good. By 1932, Lucky Luciano had done the unthinkable. He brought order to chaos. The Mafia, once a loose collection of feuding street gangs and Sicilian strongmen, now functioned like a perfectly tuned machine. Every family had its own territory, its own business, and its own leader, but all were bound under one central authority, the Commission. It was, in every sense, the underworld's answer to the U.S. government. At its core, the Commission was both genius and irony. On paper, it looked democratic, a council of equals where disputes were resolved by discussion, not bullets. But in reality, Luciano sat at its center not as a dictator but as a power broker. He didn't rule through fear like Masuria or Maranzano had. He ruled through influence, charisma, and a kind of cold logic that made rebellion seem irrational. Every boss owed him something, a favor, an introduction, or a fortune. He didn't need to demand loyalty, he engineered it. The first official meeting of the commission took place in Chicago, hosted by Al Capone's syndicate, the only criminal organization powerful enough to rival New York's. Representatives from across the country attended: Joe Bonanno, Vincent Mangano, Tommy Gagliano, Joseph Prophesy, and Frank Costello. From Chicago came Frank Nitti, Capone's trusted lieutenant, and from Cleveland, the quietly dangerous Mo Dalitz. It wasn't just an Italian affair. Jewish and Irish figures like Lansky and Madden were part of the broader syndicate structure. To outsiders, it was simply another mob gathering. But to those present it felt like history. They were creating something no one had ever dared to imagine. A national alliance of criminals, bound by rules and guided by reason. Luciano laid down those rules with surgical precision. No family was to interfere in another's territory without approval. No hits on major figures could be carried out without the commission's consent. Disputes would be settled at the table, not on the streets. Every racket, from gambling to narcotics, would be regulated to avoid chaos. The 5 families of New York would act as the council's permanent members, with other regions, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, granted associate representation. It was the ultimate illusion of equality. Behind the formalities, the commission functioned less like a democracy and more like a cartel. It fixed prices, divided territories, and managed conflicts with the precision of a corporate board. When disputes arose, and they always did, Luciano served as the quiet arbitrator, the one man everyone trusted to remain impartial. He played enemies against each other, ensuring that no one ever became powerful enough to threaten his balance of control. The brilliance of Luciano's system was its adaptability. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the old Sicilian Mafia, the commission could evolve. It could expand, subcontract, and diversify. In Luciano's words, "We're not running rackets, we're running industries." And industries they were. Gambling was their bread and butter, from backroom card games to high-end casinos. Bootlegging, though waning after the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, had already made them millionaires. They pivoted quickly to other ventures: labor racketeering, construction, trucking, and nightclubs. Through front companies, unions, and political connections, the Mafia's money began to flow into legitimate businesses. Their fingerprints appeared on movie studios, hotels, even the shipping docks of New York Harbor. The underworld had gone corporate, and the line between legitimate and illegal power began to blur. One of Luciano's greatest moves was embedding the Mafia into America's labor system. Working through Frank Costello and Jewish labor leaders aligned with Lansky, he infiltrated unions like the Teamsters and the Longshoremen's Association. Control of these unions meant control of the nation's ports, trucks, and warehouses, the veins of American commerce. Politicians, many of whom depended on union votes, turned a blind eye. Some even offered protection outright. It was the perfect crime, not one of violence but of integration. To the average citizen, the commission didn't exist. Newspapers spoke only of gangland killings and mob feuds, never realizing those were the exceptions, not the rule. The true power of organized crime wasn't in gunfights. It was in meetings, ledgers, and envelopes quietly exchanged in hotel lobbies. The Mafia didn't just control the streets anymore, it was part of the system. Luciano himself became the embodiment of that duality. To the world, he was a charming, impeccably dressed businessman, confident, polite, and intelligent. He frequented nightclubs with movie stars, rubbed shoulders with politicians, and spoke of ventures instead of crimes. Behind that charisma, however, was the same ruthless strategist who had ordered the deaths of 2 bosses and reshaped the underworld. His enemies called him a traitor to Sicilian tradition. His allies called him a genius. Both were right. Under the commission's rule, the Mafia reached its golden age. Murders decreased, profits soared, and public attention drifted elsewhere. The underworld was no longer a shadow, it had become part of the American fabric, invisible but omnipresent. Still, power built on silence is always fragile. For every rule Luciano created, there was someone willing to break it for a little more money, a little more respect. The structure he designed depended entirely on self-restraint, a virtue rare among men who'd risen through blood and betrayal. And then there was the other side of the coin: law enforcement. Thomas E. Dewey, a relentless young prosecutor from New York, began to notice a pattern. While the city's gang wars had stopped, its criminal profits hadn't. The violence was gone, but the money still moved, quietly, systematically. Dewey started to suspect that what appeared to be peace was, in truth, perfect organization. Luciano's greatest achievement was also his greatest vulnerability: visibility through invisibility. He had built a structure so stable, so sophisticated, that its very efficiency began to attract attention. But in the mid-1930s, that danger was still distant. For now, the Commission ruled like an invisible government, unseen, unchallenged, and unstoppable. In smoke-filled hotel rooms and marble-lined restaurants, decisions were made that shaped entire industries. The Mafia didn't need ballots or borders. It had influence. It had silence. It had fear. Lucky Luciano had turned organized crime into an institution, one that would outlive him, outgrow him, and ultimately destroy everything it touched. He had replaced honor with order, chaos with control. And in doing so, he had created something far more dangerous than violence: stability. The kind of stability that hides rot until it's too late to stop. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano stood at the peak of his power. He had done what no mobster before him could, turned an empire of killers and thieves into a disciplined network that spanned the United States. He sat atop the underworld not as a warlord but as a chairman. But in a world built on secrets and fear, power always carried a hidden cost: paranoia. For every alliance Luciano forged, there was an enemy waiting in the shadows, and sometimes they were the same people. The Mafia's new structure had created order, yes, but it had also created ambition. Every boss who sat at the Commission's table wanted a larger piece of the pie. Every underboss dreamed of one day becoming the man at the center. And though Luciano ruled through balance, his calm exterior masked a life spent reading faces, measuring motives, and anticipating betrayal before it arrived. His closest ally, and perhaps his mirror, was Meyer Lansky. The Jewish accountant of crime, Lansky was the mind behind the money. While Luciano understood organization, Lansky understood systems. Numbers, investments, the invisible architecture of profit. Together, they represented the evolution of the American gangster. One with muscle and one with mathematics. Lansky was fiercely loyal but pragmatic. He didn't care about Sicilian codes or rituals, he cared about efficiency. Their partnership wasn't born of brotherhood, it was born of mutual understanding. Luciano needed Lansky's brain, Lansky needed Luciano's muscle. Both understood that in business trust wasn't emotional, it was transactional. Then there was Frank Costello, suave, political, the diplomat among killers. Costello had the kind of influence no gun could buy. He could walk into a room of senators and leave with favors. His connections in City Hall and law enforcement kept the gears of the Mafia turning smoothly. Costello was the public face of legitimacy, the man who made the underworld respectable. Together, Luciano, Lansky, and Costello formed what law enforcement would later call the Big Three. Their alliance transformed organized crime into something closer to a corporation than a gang. But the higher Luciano climbed, the thinner the air became. And in that thin air, enemies gathered. One of the first signs of trouble came from within the Commission itself. A subtle power play by Joe Bonanno, a younger boss with old-school ambitions. Bonanno admired Luciano's intelligence but loathed his partnerships with Jews and Irishmen. To Bonanno, the Mafia should remain purely Sicilian, untainted by outsiders. He saw Luciano's modernism not as progress but as betrayal. Whispers began to circulate, that Luciano was losing touch with the old ways, that his alliances were dangerous, that he was placing money above honor. Ironically, those whispers came from men who owed their wealth to the very system Luciano had built. Even Meyer Lansky, always the realist, sensed the shifting tone. "They'll love you while you make them rich," he told Luciano. "But the minute something goes wrong, they'll remember you're not one of them." It was a warning, and it would prove prophetic. Outside the Mafia, another storm brewed. Thomas E. Dewey, the crusading special prosecutor of New York, had begun to make his name targeting organized crime. Dewey was everything Luciano wasn't: puritanical, relentless, and incorruptible. While most politicians could be bought, Dewey couldn't. He viewed men like Luciano as a cancer on America's moral fabric, and he was determined to cut it out. But before Dewey could reach Luciano, another enemy, quieter, more personal, was about to strike. One of Luciano's oldest allies was a woman named Cokie Flo Brown, a high-end madam who ran prostitution rings connected to the Mafia's vice network. For years, Luciano had denied any direct involvement in prostitution, seeing it as dirty business. But through Flo and others, he benefited from it indirectly, through protection rackets, payoffs, and cuts of profits. When Dewey's investigators began raiding brothels across Manhattan, Cokie Flo was caught. Facing prison, she made a choice that would echo through Luciano's empire. She talked. Her testimony linked Luciano directly to a prostitution ring spanning dozens of cities. Whether the charges were exaggerated or not didn't matter. The story alone was enough to damage him. And suddenly, All those quiet whispers inside the commission grew louder. Allies began to distance themselves. No one wanted to stand too close to a man under investigation. Costello worked behind the scenes to protect political interests. Lansky moved money offshore, and even longtime soldiers began to hedge their loyalty. Luciano, for all his cunning, found himself caught in a trap of perception. In the underworld, power depended on myth, and that myth was cracking. The man who had once seemed untouchable now looked vulnerable. He responded with the same cold logic that had built his empire. He reminded his men that loyalty wasn't about morality, it was about survival. If they come for me, he told Costello, they'll come for all of us. The minute one of us falls, the whole thing shakes. But privately he understood something deeper. Betrayal was inevitable. It was the currency of the world he had built. The same system that rewarded ambition also ensured that no one could ever be fully trusted. Lansky once said Luciano's greatest strength was his detachment. His ability to make decisions without emotion. Yet in this moment, that detachment began to isolate him. For the first time he couldn't tell where the next knife would come from, the courtroom or the street. The commission watched silently as Dewey's case gained momentum. Luciano's enemies didn't need to conspire against him. All they had to do was wait. The golden age of peace that Luciano had engineered was showing cracks. Beneath the polished surface of order, greed and fear were festering. The alliances that once symbolized strength now hinted at weakness. In the shadows, the commission's balance began to wobble. Some wanted to protect Luciano, others wanted to see what would happen without him. Because in a world ruled by money, control and silence, loyalty was never permanent. It was just the space between opportunity and betrayal. And as the investigators closed in, Lucky Luciano, the man who built America's invisible empire, would soon discover that the most dangerous enemies were not the ones who shot at you. They were the ones who smiled, raised a glass to your success, and quietly prepared for your fall. By 1935, Lucky Luciano's empire stretched from the docks of New York to the casinos of Miami and the brothels of Chicago. His name was whispered in every backroom, every precinct, every courtroom, and yet officially he didn't exist. He owned nothing, signed nothing, and commanded everything. To the public he was a ghost in a tailored suit. To law enforcement he was the man behind the curtain. But ghosts have enemies too. The war that was coming wasn't fought with Tommy guns or car bombs. It was fought with subpoenas, headlines, and fear, a hidden war between a man who believed he owned the city, and a system determined to prove no one was above the law. At the center of that war stood Thomas E. Dewey, New York's relentless special prosecutor. Young, ambitious, and incorruptible, Dewey saw Luciano as more than a gangster. He was the symbol of everything rotting inside America's soul. Organized vice, political corruption, moral decay, all roads led in Dewey's eyes to Lucky Luciano. The irony was that Luciano had kept his hands clean. He rarely appeared in the same room as his operations. He spoke through intermediaries, paid through couriers, and made decisions in whispers. He had built his empire on the principle of distance. The less his name appeared in records, the safer he was. But Dewey didn't need a confession. He needed a narrative. In early 1936, Dewey's investigators began a systematic campaign against New York's sex trade, a network of brothels, madams, and pimps that generated millions. Raids swept through Manhattan and Brooklyn. Dozens of prostitutes were arrested, interrogated, and offered deals, freedom in exchange for information. Most stayed silent. But one woman didn't, Cokie Flo Brown, the same madam who had once trusted Luciano's protection. Terrified of prison and furious at being abandoned, she began to talk. Her story was vivid, emotional, and damning. According to Flo, Luciano wasn't just aware of the prostitution racket. He was its mastermind. She claimed he took a percentage of profits from dozens of brothels, that his men enforced discipline, and that no operation could run without his blessing. Her testimony turned the invisible boss into a criminal kingpin. It didn't matter that much of it was hearsay, or that Flo was an unreliable witness. Dewey had what he needed, a human story, a symbol of morality versus corruption. The press devoured it. Headlines screamed, Luciano vice ring exposed. Newspapers painted him as a suave, unfeeling villain who exploited women while living in luxury. The irony was sharp. The man who had built an empire on structure and restraint was now accused of wallowing in filth. Inside his suite at the Waldorf Towers, Luciano raged privately. He called the charges ridiculous, insisting he had no need for the prostitution racket. It's small-time garbage, he told Costello. But he also knew this wasn't about truth anymore. It was about perception. And perception was something Dewey understood as well as any mobster. Dewey built his case like a showman. He wanted the public on his side. He staged press conferences, leaked dramatic testimony, and turned the trial into theater. Each prostitute's confession added to the chorus of accusation. Each article made Luciano look less like a businessman and more like a monster. Luciano's lawyers tried to fight back, arguing there was no proof, no financial records, no wiretaps, no witnesses who had ever met him personally. But Dewey's genius was in the psychology of narrative. He knew the public didn't need evidence, they needed a face. And Lucky Luciano's face, handsome, confident, unrepentant, was perfect for the role of America's criminal enemy. Behind the scenes, the commission was nervous. The organization was built to survive war, not public exposure. A conviction could unravel everything. Some bosses began to distance themselves. Others whispered about removing Luciano quietly to preserve the structure. But no one dared act, not yet. As the trial approached, Luciano considered fleeing. Lansky offered him safe passage to Cuba. Others suggested he go underground until the heat cooled. But Luciano refused. "If I run," he said, "I'm guilty." His pride wouldn't let him disappear. He believed, as always, that he could outthink the system, that lawmen were just another kind of gangster, and every gangster had a price. He underestimated Dewey. In April 1936, Luciano was arrested in Hot Springs, Arkansas. He had gone south for a brief trip, perhaps thinking he could escape the New York chaos. But Dewey's reach was long, and this time politics was on the prosecutor's side. Under heavy police escort, Luciano was flown back to New York in handcuffs. The image made front-page news nationwide. It was the beginning of the end of his untouchable myth. The underworld trembled. If Luciano could be caught, anyone could. For years, the Mafia had operated under a veil of invisibility. But now, America had a villain with a name, a face, and a narrative. In the weeks that followed, Dewey's campaign expanded. He raided speakeasies, brothels, gambling dens, all in Luciano's territory. Every arrest fed the illusion that he was connected to every crime. Public opinion shifted. Politicians who once protected the mob now praised Dewey's crusade. It was in every sense a war of image. Luciano still had money, connections, and influence, but those weapons didn't work in a courtroom. His empire had been built on fear and silence, yet now words were his undoing. Women he'd never met described him as a shadowy puppet master. Prosecutors dramatized every rumor. The jury didn't see a businessman, they saw the devil in a silk suit. In private, Luciano's confidence began to crack. "They can't prove a damn thing," he told Costello, but the words carried less conviction each time. For the first time, Lucky Luciano was playing defense. This wasn't the street wars of old, where bullets could solve problems. This was psychological warfare, and Dewey was winning. By summer, the newspapers had already decided the verdict. Dewey's campaign wasn't just about Luciano, it was about symbolism. If he could take down the most powerful gangster in America, he could prove that law and order still ruled the nation. And as Luciano sat in his cell awaiting trial, he realized something chilling. He had built an empire that could withstand violence, betrayal, even death. But he had never prepared it to withstand public opinion. The same world that once admired his genius now demanded his destruction. The newspapers, the politicians, the prosecutors, they were the commission now. And unlike the Mafia, their loyalty was to spectacle. The hidden war was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, and for the first time, Lucky Luciano was losing. The year was 1936, and the once invincible Lucky Luciano now found himself seated in a New York courtroom, surrounded not by loyal lieutenants, but by prosecutors, reporters, and a jury eager to witness his fall. The man who had ruled the underworld with intellect and precision, the man who'd replaced violence with structure, was about to face the most ruthless opponent of his career, the American justice system. To the public, the trial wasn't just about one man. It was a moral spectacle, the people versus corruption itself. Thomas E. Dewey had turned the proceedings into theater, and the stage lights burned bright. The courtroom overflowed daily with journalists, politicians, curious citizens, and even socialites eager to glimpse the man called the Lord of the Underworld. Luciano arrived each day impeccably dressed, tailored suits, silk ties, calm expression, as if to remind the world that he was still in control. But beneath that polished exterior, cracks had begun to form. He understood how power worked in the streets, through fear, respect, and silence. But here in this courtroom the rules were different. Words, not bullets, would decide his fate. Dewey, sharp and relentless, built his case piece by piece. He called witness after witness, prostitutes, pimps, madams, each telling stories of how Luciano's men collected payments, enforced discipline and dictated operations. Some of their testimonies were exaggerated, others completely fabricated, but Dewey knew something crucial. Juries believed emotion more than evidence. An emotion Dewey had in abundance. His voice carried the righteousness of a man who believed he was cleansing his city. He painted Luciano as a manipulative tyrant, a man who exploited women, corrupted politicians, and built an empire on misery. He hid behind wealth and charm, Dewey thundered, but beneath that surface lies the most dangerous criminal mind in America. The words hit like bullets, not in the body but in the myth. Luciano's defense, led by lawyer George Morton Levy, countered that the entire case rested on the testimony of unreliable witnesses. There were no financial records, no direct communications, no hard proof linking Luciano to the prostitution racket. The defense argued that Luciano was the victim of political ambition, a convenient scapegoat in Dewey's rise to fame. But truth in 1936 was a poor weapon against theater. Outside the courthouse, the press was relentless. Headlines screamed, "Luciano's vice empire exposed," and "Gang King faces ruin." Editorials praised Dewey as a hero of justice. For the first time, the public saw the underworld not as romantic rogues, but as parasites. The cultural tide had turned, and Luciano, once admired for his intelligence and power, now symbolized everything Americans wanted to destroy. Still, he refused to show weakness. Each morning, he walked into court with a faint smile, nodding to reporters as if this were all a misunderstanding. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his voice was measured and confident. "They can't prove what isn't true," he told journalists. But even as he said it, he knew that this wasn't about proof, it was about perception. Behind closed doors, his empire was unraveling. Associates who once pledged undying loyalty began disappearing. Some fled the country, others turned to Dewey's investigators for protection. Money dried up as police raids crippled businesses tied to his operations. And the commission, the very institution he had built, stayed silent. They couldn't afford to be seen helping him. Meyer Lansky, ever pragmatic, focused on damage control, moving assets and dissolving partnerships before law enforcement could trace them. Frank Costello worked his political contacts, trying to soften the eventual blow. But neither man could stop what was coming. Dewey's case, though built on shaky evidence, was airtight in presentation. The jury didn't need documents or contracts. They had stories, vivid, sensational human stories, and Dewey made sure they stuck. One witness described seeing Luciano's men deliver envelopes of cash directly to him at the Waldorf. Another claimed she had overheard him dictating house rules for brothel operations. None of it could be verified, but it didn't matter. The courtroom wasn't a place for truth, it was a stage for persuasion. By the end of the trial, even Luciano's calm mask began to slip. He sat quietly through testimony, occasionally whispering to his lawyers, his eyes sharp but weary. He'd spent his life mastering control, over men, over money, over fate, and now, for the first time, everything depended on 12 strangers. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. When they returned, the courtroom went silent. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and read the verdict. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano didn't flinch. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set, his eyes unreadable. But inside he felt something break. Not fear, not regret, but disbelief. He had survived gang wars, betrayal, assassins, and coups. He had built an empire from nothing. Yet here he was, defeated not by guns but by words. Judge Philip McCook sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison, the harshest penalty ever given to a major organized crime figure. Reporters scribbled furiously as Dewey stood victorious, shaking hands with his team. The headlines that followed were triumphant: "Luciano convicted. Dewey cleans up New York." Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered. Inside, Luciano sat motionless, his expression calm, but his mind raced. He wasn't thinking about prison. He was thinking about what came next. He knew prisons couldn't hold power, only people. Power existed in minds, in fear, in systems. The commission still operated. The racket still ran. The money still flowed. And even from behind bars he could still reach them. As he was led away in chains, a reporter shouted, "Lucky, any last words?" Luciano paused, smirked faintly, and said, "Tell Dewey he'll see me again." The fall of Lucky Luciano was complete, but not final. Because while Dewey had won the battle for justice, Luciano still held the battlefield of influence. The law could cage his body but not his ideas. And deep inside Dannemora prison, behind iron bars and watchtowers, the man who once ruled America's underworld began to rebuild, not with soldiers or money but with patience and memory. He had lost his kingdom, but the king was still thinking. And for a man like Lucky Luciano, thought was the deadliest weapon of all. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. For Charles Lucky Luciano, it wasn't just a verdict, it was a public execution. The headlines would say guilty, but what they really meant was defeated. After years of ruling America's underworld from penthouse suites and cigar-filled backrooms, the man who made the Mafia a business now stood shackled like a common criminal. When Judge Philip McCook pronounced the sentence, 30 to 50 years in state prison, the air seemed to collapse. Reporters scribbled furiously, photographers flashed their bulbs. And through it all, Luciano sat still, his jaw clenched, his eyes hollow yet defiant. In that silence, there was something almost regal, the posture of a man who refused to bow, even as the empire he'd built turned to smoke. To the outside world it was a victory for justice. To the underworld, it was the death of invincibility. Thomas E. Dewey, now a national hero, was lauded as the man who had done the impossible, brought down the invisible empire. He had turned an obscure prosecutor's office into a moral crusade. Overnight, Dewey's name became synonymous with integrity, ambition, and incorruptibility. For him, the conviction wasn't just a case, it was a political springboard. For Luciano, it was a life sentence, not just in prison but in memory. Yet behind the moral triumph, the cracks were already forming. Many in the legal world quietly questioned Dewey's methods. The testimonies had been emotional but inconsistent. Witnesses were unreliable, their stories contradictory, their motives questionable. Even some jurors later admitted they'd been swept up by the spectacle, by the image of Luciano as the face of organized vice. But the public didn't care about legal nuance. They wanted a villain, and Dewey had given them one. Luciano was transferred first to Sing Sing, then to the remote Dannemora prison, a fortress in upstate New York known among inmates as Little Siberia. The cold, the isolation, the monotony, it was a world designed to break men. Guards watched him like a specimen, curious to see how the king of the underworld would survive behind bars. And yet, Luciano adapted. He had always been a pragmatist. The same instincts that made him a master strategist on the streets now served him in confinement. He studied the routines, the guards, the hierarchy of inmates. Within months he had influence again. He wasn't ordering hits or smuggling contraband, not directly anyway. But prisoners respected him. Guards listened when he spoke. Even behind concrete walls, his authority carried weight. He never lost his composure. "I made my bed," he told a fellow inmate. "Now I sleep in it." But inside he was seething. Not at Dewey, not even at the witnesses, but at the system that had beaten him at his own game. He had built his empire on control of men, of information, of fear. And now the state had done the same to him. They'd turned his own strategy against him. Meanwhile, the outside world was changing. The Great Depression was waning and America was shifting toward something new, a sense of purpose, a hunger for stability. Dewey's victory had given the nation a symbol of order, but the underworld didn't disappear. It simply evolved. Luciano's lieutenants, Costello, Lansky, Genovese, continued to run operations quietly, keeping the machine alive. The commission didn't dissolve, it adapted. Letters and coded messages still traveled upstate. Every decision, every alliance, every major move passed, directly or indirectly, through Luciano. He couldn't sign orders, but he could suggest. And in the Mafia, a suggestion from Lucky was as good as law. The irony was rich. The man condemned to rot in a frozen cell was still, in practice, the most powerful criminal in America. Still, the confinement wore at him. The structure, the monotony, the endless repetition. They gnawed at a man who had once controlled cities. Some nights, when the prison went silent, he would sit awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision that led him there. He had always believed in strategy, that every move had a purpose. But now he wondered if his greatest strength had also been his undoing. He had replaced the old Mafia's honor with efficiency, built a system without emotion, and created loyalty that depended only on profit. And when profit was threatened, so was loyalty. In a sense, Luciano wasn't just imprisoned by the state, he was imprisoned by his own creation. Outside, Dewey's fame soared. He was appointed district attorney, then governor of New York, and even ran for president in 1944. Luciano watched from afar as his rival climbed higher, the embodiment of lawful ambition. It was almost poetic, Two men who had mastered power in different worlds, one through law, one through crime, and both bound by the same hunger to dominate. As the years passed, Luciano began to fade from headlines. The world moved on, new wars, new heroes, new villains. But among the old guard of the Mafia, his legend only grew. They whispered his name with reverence, not pity. He had faced the system head-on and never betrayed his own. Still, there were moments of bitterness. When asked once if he felt remorse, he replied, "For what? For being smarter than the next guy?" But then, quieter, he added, "Maybe for thinking I could outsmart everybody." By the late 1930s, whispers began circulating through the prison system. Luciano was restless. His health was declining, but his mind was sharp as ever. Rumors spread that he was negotiating something, through lawyers, politicians, or even military contacts. And then came the war, World War II, and with it, the strangest twist in organized crime's history. The same government that had condemned Lucky Luciano as America's most dangerous criminal would soon come knocking on his cell door, asking for help. In a few short years, the man they had chained would become useful again. Because power, as Luciano had always known, never really disappears. It just changes form. And soon, the king in chains would prove that even a prison couldn't stop him from pulling the strings of the world outside. Prison walls are meant to contain men, but not minds. For Charles Lucky Luciano, incarceration became just another playing field, another system to understand, manipulate, and quietly rule from within. The state thought it had buried the underworld's mastermind in a concrete tomb, but what they didn't realize was that Luciano had never needed a gun or a street corner to exert control. His greatest weapon had always been influence, and influence could seep through any wall. By the early 1940s, Luciano had adapted to life in Dannemora, New York's frozen fortress known for breaking the toughest inmates. He worked in the prison laundry, read constantly, and maintained an air of calm authority. The guards respected him. The inmates, even hardened killers, deferred to him. He never barked orders or used threats. Instead, he listened, reasoned, and traded favors. The same soft power that once built the commission now governed the prison yard. In small ways, he recreated his empire. Smuggling rings emerged inside the prison. Cigarettes, contraband liquor, black market goods, all operating with quiet precision. Luciano didn't handle them directly, but everyone knew they operated with his blessing. His code of efficiency and silence survived even here. To those who had known him on the outside, it was proof that Lucky never really lost control. But even beyond the prison's barbed wire, his name still carried weight. The Mafia's upper echelon, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others, maintained regular contact through coded letters and intermediaries. His lawyer, Moses Polikoff, served as both legal counsel and messenger, ferrying information in and out under the guise of legitimate correspondence. When a dispute arose in New York, the decision-makers didn't ask who was in charge. They asked, "What does Charlie say?" And Charlie always had something to say. The late 1930s and early 40s brought a world in chaos. America edged toward war, Europe was burning, and the government's priorities began to shift from local crime to global survival. That shift would become Luciano's unlikely lifeline. In 1942, an incident shook the American East Coast. The sinking of the SS Normandy, a massive French luxury liner turned troopship, docked in New York Harbor. The ship caught fire mysteriously and capsized, sparking panic. Rumors spread of Nazi sabotage along the docks. The U.S. Navy, desperate to secure the waterfront, faced a problem. The docks were controlled not by military officers but by the Mafia. The man who held that control? Lucky Luciano. Through a web of dock unions, longshoremen, and political connections, Luciano's influence reached deep into the port of New York. Smugglers, stevedores, and union bosses all had ties to his organization. The Navy couldn't protect the docks without help from the very criminals it had spent years trying to destroy. That's when an extraordinary deal began to take shape, a secret alliance between the United States government and the imprisoned king of the Mafia. Under what became known as Operation Underworld, naval intelligence reached out quietly through intermediaries, eventually contacting Meyer Lansky. Lansky confirmed what the Navy already suspected. Luciano still commanded absolute loyalty, even from behind bars. If they wanted the docks secure, they needed his blessing. Through a carefully orchestrated channel, naval intelligence officers met with Luciano's lawyer and arranged a proposal. In exchange for his cooperation in securing the docks, the government would consider reducing his sentence. It was a stunning reversal. The man branded as America's most dangerous criminal was now being enlisted as a patriotic asset. From his cell, Luciano set to work. Through his old network, particularly Joseph Sachs Lanza, the powerful seafood union leader, he ordered the underworld to assist the U.S. war effort. Dock thefts dropped. Sabotage rumors vanished. Information flowed efficiently between the docks and naval intelligence. The cooperation extended even further. When the Allies prepared to invade Sicily in 1943, intelligence suggested that local mafia contacts could ease the landing. Once again, the U.S. military turned to Luciano, whose old connections in Sicily were invaluable. Through indirect channels, his network helped American forces gain local support, navigate terrain, and neutralize resistance. Historians still debate how deep Luciano's involvement went, but what's clear is that his reputation alone carried enough weight to open doors, even from a cell 4,000 miles away. In less than a decade, the same government that had called him a parasite now referred to him as useful. The irony was not lost on Luciano. When one of his lawyers hinted at the Navy's gratitude, he reportedly smiled and said, "So now I'm a patriot?" Still, he played the game carefully. He knew his leverage was temporary, and when the war ended, gratitude would fade. He needed something tangible, his freedom. By 1945, Dewey, the very man who had put him away, was now governor of New York. Under pressure from several sources, including the Navy's quiet endorsements and Lansky's political maneuvering, Dewey agreed to commute Luciano's sentence in recognition of his wartime assistance. On January 3, 1946, after nearly a decade in prison, Luciano's sentence was commuted on one condition. He would be deported to Italy and never return to the United States. When the news broke, the public reaction was divided. To some, it was justice, exile for a criminal mastermind. To others, it was betrayal, a symbol of how power always finds a way to protect itself. Dewey framed it as a pragmatic act of mercy. Luciano framed it as victory. As he walked out of prison, reporters surrounded him, shouting questions. He didn't answer. He simply smiled, lit a cigarette, and said to one guard, "See? Told you I wouldn't die in there." That smile, part defiance, part triumph, said everything. He had entered prison as a king in chains. He left as a man who had proven beyond all doubt that power isn't about freedom. It's about relevance. And as the plane carried him away from America's shores, Lucky Luciano wasn't thinking of loss. He was thinking of opportunity. Because even in exile he knew one truth: as long as men wanted money, vice, and power, the world would always have a place for Lucky Luciano. When Charles Lucky Luciano's ship docked in Naples in February 1946, the air was heavy with irony. The man who had built America's criminal empire with precision and intellect was now a foreigner in the land of his birth, stripped of citizenship, reputation, and empire. As he stepped off the ship, reporters gathered like vultures, shouting questions in English and Italian. Luciano, wearing his familiar fedora and a faint smile, muttered simply, "Home again, but not by choice." Italy didn't feel like home. It was chaos. The war had left the country in ruins. Buildings crumbled, poverty spread like disease, and the black market had become the lifeline of survival. The irony was cruel. Luciano, the man who perfected organized crime, had returned to a nation where crime was now the only functioning economy. For the first few months, he lived quietly in Naples, surrounded by curious journalists and suspicious police. The Italian government, pressured by the Americans, kept him under strict surveillance. Every move he made, every visitor, every phone call, was logged. But Lucky was used to eyes watching him. He understood that visibility was a kind of camouflage. The best way to hide was to appear unbothered. He spent his days drinking espresso in cafes, reading American newspapers, and reminiscing about New York. But beneath the calm exterior, his mind was turning. The streets of America might have been closed to him, but his reach was not. The Commission still respected him. The younger generation of mobsters, men like Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, viewed him as a living legend. From exile, Luciano began to rebuild, not through force but through diplomacy. He established himself as a neutral advisor, a kind of elder statesman of organized crime. If a dispute arose between American families or Sicilian factions, his opinion was sought. Messages arrived through couriers, lawyers, and old associates like Meyer Lansky, who managed his financial interests in Havana and New York. In the shadows of post-war Europe, another market was emerging, one far more lucrative than gambling or liquor: the heroin trade. With supply routes running from the Middle East through Italy and France to America, Luciano found himself in a unique position. He knew the ports, the smugglers, and the men who could move product unseen. According to law enforcement reports, he became a silent architect of what would later be called the French Connection. Whether he directly controlled it remains debated, but one thing is certain. Wherever there was organization, structure, and profit, Luciano's fingerprints were not far behind. Yet for all his attempts to stay relevant, exile carried a quiet pain. The world he had known, the nightclubs, the smoky backrooms, the political deals, was gone. His old friends were aging, dying, or turning legitimate. Frank Costello was now a semi-respectable businessman. Meyer Lansky had diversified into casinos in Havana. Genovese, the man who once betrayed him, was back in New York trying to take over the throne. Luciano watched from afar, frustrated but fascinated. The empire he built had survived, but without him it had changed. The Mafia was no longer a fraternity bound by his vision of unity and profit. It had become colder, more violent, more fragmented. The very structure that had made it efficient was now turning it mechanical. In letters to old associates he wrote bitterly, "They call it the commission still, but it's not mine anymore. They think short-term, they don't understand the business. No honor, no brains, just greed." That word, honor, haunted him. The same man who had dismantled the romantic code of the old Mafia now longed for the stability it once offered. He had replaced fear with profit, loyalty with efficiency, and now in his final years he watched as both eroded. His physical health began to decline. Years of prison life, heavy smoking, and stress caught up with him. He suffered from heart problems and bouts of depression. In Naples he lived modestly, often alone. The police continued to shadow him, but even they began to view him less as a threat and more as a relic, a ghost from a vanished era. In 1947, Luciano attempted one last grasp at power. He traveled to Havana, where Meyer Lansky was building a gambling paradise under the protection of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Havana was meant to be Luciano's new empire, a neutral ground where crime, politics, and money could blend freely under the Caribbean sun. For a brief time it worked. Luciano hosted lavish meetings with American mobsters, including Frank Costello, Santo Trafficante, and Albert Anastasia. The Havana Conference of 1946 became legendary, a summit that reaffirmed Luciano's influence. He spoke not as a fugitive but as a patriarch. "We built this together," he reminded them. "Don't ruin it with stupidity." But the glory was short-lived. When U.S. authorities learned of his presence, pressure mounted on the Cuban government. Luciano was swiftly arrested and deported back to Italy, his brief return to power extinguished. Back in Naples his life grew quieter. He spent evenings with a few close friends, listening to American jazz records, flipping through old photographs of New York, and reminiscing about what he called the days when men had rules. He was philosophical now, not repentant but reflective. "I never wanted to hurt nobody," he once said. "I just wanted to run things right. Maybe that was my mistake." By the late 1950s, Luciano was a man out of time, a ghost watching history move on without him. His influence lingered in the underworld structure, but his relevance was fading. The Mafia was no longer guided by visionaries, it was ruled by opportunists. On January 26, 1962, Luciano arrived at Naples airport to meet an American film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. It was supposed to be his grand reintroduction to the world, the legend telling his own story. But fate had other plans. As he greeted the producer outside the terminal, Luciano suddenly collapsed. His heart gave out instantly. The man who once ruled America's underworld died not in a courtroom or a back alley, but on an airport sidewalk, waiting for his story to be told. When news of his death reached America, even his enemies paused. Newspapers printed respectful obituaries. Old mobsters raised glasses in quiet tribute. Dewey himself, when asked for comment, simply said, "He was the smartest of them all." Luciano's body was returned to New York, the city that had made him and destroyed him. Thousands attended his funeral in Queens. His coffin was carried not by politicians or gangsters, but by men who had known him as Charlie, a man who believed in order, vision, and loyalty, even when the world around him betrayed all three. In exile he had lost his country but not his identity. In death, Lucky Luciano finally returned home, to the city he never truly left. When Lucky Luciano died he left behind more than an empire, he left a design. The commission, the structure, the business model of crime, all of it bore his signature. He had turned chaos into corporation, giving the Mafia rules, order, and logic. His genius was simplicity. Crime should be organized, profitable, and silent. What once was a brotherhood of violence became a network of businessmen in suits, meeting like executives, speaking like diplomats. Luciano didn't just build the modern mafia, he professionalized corruption. But with order came emptiness. The code of honor that once bound men was replaced by greed. After Luciano, loyalty was no longer sacred, it was transactional. The system he built endured, but without his balance, it became hollow. His successors wanted fame, not discipline. They mistook visibility for power, forgetting that Luciano's true art was invisibility. Law enforcement eventually dismantled his structure using the very clarity he created. Ironically, the organization that made crime efficient also made it traceable. Even so, his philosophy lived on, in the mafia, in politics, in corporations. Lucky Luciano taught the world that power isn't about violence, it's about control. He understood people, fear, and ambition better than anyone. He wasn't just a gangster, he was the first criminal strategist of the modern age. And in that sense, his legacy was both empire and curse. When the final act of Lucky Luciano's life played out, the world was left wondering, was he a criminal mastermind or a visionary misunderstood by time? His name had become legend, whispered with both admiration and fear. But behind the myth stood a man, not invincible, not immortal, just a boy from Sicily who refused to be forgotten. Luciano's journey was never just about crime, it was about belonging. He came to America as an outsider, a poor immigrant in a city that divided people by language, class, and blood. Every rejection carved something into him: ambition, defiance, the need to prove that power could rewrite destiny. When society shut its doors, Luciano built his own empire, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, until even the men who once ignored him were forced to respect his name. He understood something few others did. In America, crime wasn't a rebellion against the system, it was a reflection of it. The Mafia, under Luciano, became a mirror of corporate capitalism, efficient, profit-driven, and brutally pragmatic. His commission operated like a boardroom, his capos like executives. For the first time, the Mafia wasn't chaos, it was order. And in that order, Luciano found immortality. But his greatest strength became his greatest curse. The system he built outgrew him, evolving into a machine that cared more for money than men. The old codes of honor, loyalty, silence, respect, turned into myths, convenient lies told to justify greed. The young gangsters who followed him inherited his blueprint but none of his restraint. They wanted fame, headlines, and power without patience. Luciano had created the future, but he no longer recognized it. In exile, far from the city that made him, he lived surrounded by ghosts. Old friends turned enemies, old enemies long buried. Reporters often described him as calm, almost philosophical. He would sit alone at night, smoking, watching ships pass through the Naples harbor. To the world he was Lucky Luciano, untouchable, legendary. But in those quiet hours, he was simply Charles Lucania again, the immigrant who once dreamed of being accepted. When he died in 1962, his heart gave out suddenly, perhaps from years of tension, perhaps from carrying too many secrets. He died not in violence but in silence, a fitting end for a man who spent his life mastering it. Thousands came to his funeral. Some mourned a friend. Some came out of respect. Others came out of fear. But they all came, proof that even in death, his shadow loomed large. Luciano's story endures because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. He blurred the line between good and evil, between ambition and corruption. He showed that power in any form demands sacrifice, and that loyalty once traded for profit can never be bought back. In the end, Lucky Luciano wasn't just the man who built the American Mafia. He was the man who revealed the American soul, its hunger, its brilliance, its contradictions. There was an underworld before Lucky Luciano. And there was everything after.